January 17th, 1945, Luzon Island, Philippines. The jungle breathed with an ancient stillness that morning. Vines thick as a man's arm coiled through mahogany trees, their roots drinking from soil that had known centuries of silence. Moisture hung in the air like wet wool, and the only sounds were the distant shriek of a hornbill and the rhythmic drip of condensation falling from leaf to leaf. Then, somewhere beyond the wall of green, came a new sound, a mechanical growl that did not belong to any living thing. The earth trembled, birds erupted from the canopy in panicked clouds, and in hidden foxholes carved into the hillside, Japanese infantrymen pressed their bodies against the damp earth and waited for something they had been told could not exist. They had been waiting for weeks now, these soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, dug into positions they believed were impregnable. Their officers had assured them that the dense Philippine jungle was their greatest ally, that no American armor could navigate these choked valleys and vine-strangled slopes. Tanks belonged to open fields and European plains, not to places where roots formed natural barriers and the undergrowth grew so thick a man could barely see 10 meters ahead. The Japanese defensive doctrine had been built on this certainty. They had constructed networks of bunkers and pillboxes, each one positioned to command overlapping fields of fire through narrow corridors hacked from the vegetation. They had stockpiled ammunition and rice, and they had sworn to their emperor that they would hold this ground until death claimed them all. What they had not prepared for was fire that moved on steel treads. The sound grew closer. Not the familiar rumble of conventional tanks, but something heavier, more deliberate, a grinding mechanical patience that suggested unstoppable mass. Then came another sound beneath it, a hissing that reminded some of the older soldiers of the steam trains they had ridden as boys in Osaka or Yokohama. But this was no train. When the first M4 Sherman emerged from the tree line, it pushed aside bamboo thickets as if they were merely tall grass. Its hull was painted in mottled greens and browns, and mounted where the main gun should have been was an apparatus that resembled a metal snout, the M343 flamethrower system. Behind it came another, then another, 7 tanks in all, moving in a line that seemed impossibly wide for the narrow valley floor. In Japanese military culture, there existed a concept called shimpu, the divine wind that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries before. Soldiers were taught that spirit and dedication could overcome material disadvantage, that the purity of Japanese purpose would triumph over American industrial excess. They had seen this principle tested before. At Tarawa, Japanese defenders had inflicted catastrophic casualties on American Marines, despite being outgunned and outnumbered. At Peleliu, they had turned coral caves into killing zones that consumed entire companies. They had learned to build defenses that channeled American forces into predetermined kill zones, to wait with supernatural patience for the moment when flesh and steel came within range of their concealed positions. But no amount of spiritual fortitude had prepared them for what happened next. The lead Sherman stopped 70 meters from the first line of concealed bunkers. For a moment, there was only the idle rumble of its engine. Japanese soldiers in the nearest pillbox adjusted their grip on their Arisaka rifles, calculating angles, waiting for American infantry to appear behind the tanks as they always did. Then the tank's turret rotated with hydraulic precision, and the snout pointed directly at their position. What emerged was not a shell or a bullet, but a tongue of liquid fire that arced through the humid air like a living serpent made of light. It was napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture that stuck to whatever it touched and burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. The flame stream traveled 50 meters in less than 2 seconds, entered the bunker's firing slit, and transformed the interior into a crematorium. The screaming began immediately, high-pitched, inhuman sounds that cut through the jungle's ambient noise like razors through silk. Soldiers who had accepted the possibility of death by bullet or bayonet discovered there existed terrors beyond their imagination's reach. Those caught directly in the flame stream died within seconds, their bodies consumed so rapidly they barely had time to understand what was killing them. Others, splashed with burning gel, lived longer, long enough to stumble from their positions trailing smoke, their uniforms melted into their flesh, their hands clawing at faces that no longer resembled faces. The flamethrower tanks moved methodically from position to position, each burst of fire lasting 4 to 5 seconds, each burst containing enough napalm to fill a bunker with temperatures that made concrete glow. Japanese soldiers had been trained to endure. Their military indoctrination emphasized the nobility of suffering, the honor of death in service to the emperor. Many had participated in the Senjinkan Pledge, a military code that stated death was preferable to the shame of surrender. They had expected to face machine guns, artillery, perhaps grenades thrown into their positions by American infantry. They had not expected to be cooked alive in positions that had seemed so secure just minutes before. Records from the 1st Cavalry Division, which deployed these flame tanks during the Luzon campaign, documented a phenomenon they had not anticipated: mass surrender. Japanese soldiers, many of them sobbing, emerged from positions they had sworn to defend to the death. Some had torn off their uniforms, others had their hands pressed against their ears as if they could block out the sound of their comrades burning. American officers, prepared for fanatical resistance, instead found themselves processing prisoners who seemed psychologically shattered, men who stared at the ground and trembled uncontrollably. The contrast could not have been more stark. Japanese military propaganda had spent years constructing an image of American soldiers as soft, individualistic, morally weak, products of a decadent democracy that valued comfort over sacrifice. They were told that Americans lacked the spiritual strength to endure hardship, that they would collapse when faced with determined resistance. The reality that rolled through the Philippine jungle contradicted every lesson they had internalized. These were not soft men. These were men who commanded machines that could project liquid fire across distances that made a mockery of defensive positions. These were men whose industrial capacity allowed them to manufacture specialized tanks, flame tanks, bulldozer tanks, mine-clearing tanks, in quantities that seemed to defy logic. A Japanese infantryman might have 1 rifle and 60 rounds of ammunition. His American counterpart had a rifle, a sidearm, hand grenades, access to mortars, artillery support, air support, and now tanks that could burn him out of any position he thought was safe. The flamethrower tank itself became a kind of symbol, a rolling embodiment of the vast industrial and technological chasm between the two nations. Each M4 Sherman weighed 30 tons and required hundreds of hours of skilled labor to produce. The flamethrower system alone represented engineering sophistication that Japanese industry, crippled by Allied bombing and resource scarcity, could not match. The napalm mixture was a product of American chemical research, a deliberate invention designed specifically to create a weapon that would stick and burn rather than simply explode. Even the logistics behind these machines told a story of abundance. Each flame tank carried nearly 300 gallons of napalm mixture, fuel that had been shipped across the Pacific, offloaded at forward bases and distributed to armored units as casually as ammunition. Japanese soldiers ate rice rations that grew smaller each month. American tankers had access to mechanized warfare that consumed resources on a scale that seemed almost wasteful. There exists a photograph from the Luzon campaign taken by a Signal Corps photographer in early February 1945. It shows a captured Japanese soldier sitting beside an American flame tank, his head in his hands, his uniform filthy. Next to him, an American tanker eats from a can of peaches, with a folding spoon. The tanker is not guarding the prisoner with any particular attention. He simply sits on the tank's fender, eating fruit that had been canned in California and shipped 8,000 miles to feed men who operated machines of war. The image captured something that words struggled to convey: the sheer material disparity that defined the Pacific War's final year. One man had access to canned fruit as a casual ration. The other had been driven from his position by a machine that weaponized fire itself. As the American advance continued through Luzon, reports filtered back to Japanese command describing the psychological impact of flame tank operations. Soldiers who had maintained discipline under conventional bombardment broke when confronted with the possibility of burning to death. Unit cohesion, the sacred principle of Japanese military organization, dissolved. Men who had been prepared to execute banzai charges instead hid deeper in the jungle, hoping to avoid encountering the flame tanks entirely. Some Japanese officers, recognizing that their bunker-based defensive strategy had been rendered obsolete, began advocating for dispersed guerrilla tactics, but it was too late. The Americans had identified a weakness in Japanese defensive psychology and exploited it with characteristic industrial efficiency. The flame tanks were not invincible. They were vulnerable to anti-tank weapons, to mechanical failure, to the same thick mud that slowed all vehicles in the Philippine rainy season. But their psychological impact far exceeded their tactical utility. A single flame tank could cause an entire defensive position to collapse, not through casualties, but through terror. Japanese intelligence reports from the period used words that rarely appeared in military documents: kyofu, horror, and zetsubo, despair. Soldiers described the flame tanks in terms usually reserved for natural disasters or divine punishment. Some called them jigoku no kuruma, hell's vehicles. Others simply referred to them as high, fire, as if the machines themselves were not the true threat, but rather the elemental force they commanded. What the Japanese soldiers experienced in those Philippine jungles was a kind of ideological collapse compressed into moments of extreme violence. They had been raised in a system that taught them that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that dedication and sacrifice were the ultimate weapons. The American flamethrower tanks represented a counter-argument delivered in the most visceral terms imaginable. Here was a nation that did not need to rely solely on the spirit of its soldiers because it could outfit them with machines that made conventional courage almost irrelevant. Here was a democracy that, when threatened, had transformed its industrial base into a war machine of such scale that it could produce specialized tanks for specialized purposes, tanks designed not to kill efficiently but to kill in a way that would break the will of enemy soldiers who thought they were beyond breaking. In the months that followed, as American forces pushed deeper into the Philippines and prepared for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, the flame tank became a fixture of Pacific combat operations. Doctrine evolved. Infantry learned to coordinate with flame tanks, using them as mobile bunker busters that could reduce fortified positions without requiring weeks of grinding attrition. Casualties among American forces dropped in areas where flame tanks were deployed. Japanese casualties increased, but more significantly, Japanese surrender rates climbed. Men who had been indoctrinated to believe that capture was worse than death chose capture when the alternative was burning alive in a concrete box. The war would end in August 1945, not with American tanks rolling through Japanese streets, but with atomic fire that made napalm seem almost quaint by comparison. But in the jungles of Luzon, in the hills of Okinawa, in every place where flame tanks encountered Japanese defensive positions, a smaller transformation had already occurred. Soldiers who had believed in the supremacy of spirit over material were forced to confront machines that made such beliefs tragically obsolete. The flame tanks did not just destroy bunkers, they destroyed certainties. Years later, a Japanese veteran who had faced flame tanks on Luzon would describe the experience in terms that captured something essential about that moment in history. He said that when he heard the mechanical growl of the approaching tanks, when he smelled the napalm before he saw it, he understood for the first time that Japan had not just been losing battles, it had been fighting a kind of war for which it was fundamentally unprepared. A war where the enemy's strength was measured not in courage or dedication, but in steel tonnage and chemical formulas and industrial capacity that could produce hell itself in mobile, mechanized form. The flame tanks rolled through the jungle, and the jungle burned, and with it burned the illusions that had sustained soldiers who had been taught that will alone could overcome any obstacle. What remained was smoke and the smell of charred earth, and the terrible knowledge that some forms of power cannot be resisted by spirit, no matter how pure or dedicated that spirit might be. The Americans did not just bring superior firepower to the Pacific War, they brought the industrial age itself, compressed into machines that could turn defensive positions into crematoriums, that could make the concept of a last stand seem not noble but merely futile. And in the end, that may have been the most devastating weapon of all, not the fire itself, but the understanding that fire inspired, that the war had been decided not when the first shot was fired, but years earlier, in the factories and laboratories and assembly lines of a nation that could afford to weaponize abundance itself.